Behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had gathered all the chief priests and the scribes and the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And they said unto him, In Bethlehem of Judea. For thus it is written by the prophet, And thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, art not the least among the princes of Judah. For out of thee shall come a governor, that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privately called the wise men, inquired of them diligently at what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and said, Go, and search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. We've been considering verse number 8 in the fact that they were commissioned to go and search for the Christ child. We've been considering the question, what are you searching for? And I'll read you just a few words of Christ in Matthew chapter number 7. Matthew chapter 7, verse number 7. Jesus said, Ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Verse number 8. For every one that asketh receiveth, and him that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. So going along those lines and on the mindset of searching, and what are you searching for, the Lord gave me a story entitled Searching Beyond the Fence. I know there has to be something more to this life than what I'm currently getting, thought Bassa, as he labored in his daily assigned chores. There has to be something, somewhere, someone, someplace that will fulfill the burning desire of my very soul. Do not I deserve better than the life than this? His thoughts continued as he attempted to fulfill his father's daily requirements. Why should he be denied some happiness, some joy? Why could he not experience all the world had to offer beyond the border of his father's home? He had been diligent in his obligations, and his father was one of the wealthiest men of the land. There were servants that could do his daily work, and he simply could not bear the thought of wasting his entire life at home being confined to the daily grind. He felt as if his youth was being taken from him every month, every week, every day, every hour, every minute that he was held captive by responsibility. Bassa was from a good home with a loving father and mother. He was from one of those homes that still valued and promoted the ideal of an honest day's work, living a clean and honorable life, and the notion that the family name was something that carried a reputation, one of respect, one of integrity, one of faithfulness, and one worthy to be carried on and passed down to the next generation. Now, Bassa had a wonderful set of parents, loved him, and worked hard to provide all that he needed, and as often as they could, what he wanted, within reason anyway. But he also had an older brother named Shenik, who was a true standard in the matter of dedication to his chores, dedication in his position as the eldest son, and dedications to his father's business. Shenik was in no way perfect, and he didn't always feel like being faithful. He didn't always feel like pressing on and enduring until his chores were completed. He didn't always feel like being dedicated to his father. But there was a weight of responsibility that came with being the firstborn of his father, Jehohanan. But it was that weight that he had accepted. There was the matter of integrity that he could not escape, no matter how hard he had tried at times in the past. No, he simply could not stand the thought of disappointing his father. He had before, disappointed his father. And the look that saturated Jehohanan's face, not even his words, no strong and forceful words would have been something easier to bear. But that was not his father's way, for he was a kind man, stern when necessary, yes, but at the same time fair and consistent. And the simple look of disappointment was devastating, lasting, haunting, even after all these years. No, Shenik was determined to suppress any feelings of apathy or neglect in his position of the firstborn. Besides, There was his younger brother who was in need of a good role model to follow, right? I mean, surely Bassa would see his brother's unfailing dedication and acquire a fundamental sense of integrity and responsibility as he grew and matured. Had to, right? Now, Bassa may have been from a good stock and given the proper tools to make good and wise decisions, which were initiated by his father and reinforced by his brother, but his heart was restless. And he could not stop thinking about what the rest of the world was like. He had often found himself in a battle for his thoughts, a constant war between desire and responsibility. He knew deep down inside what he must do, but his heart kept demanding attention beyond the fence. The fence. That very practical, but very dreadful fence. Now, make no mistake about it, it was indeed a proper fence, one that he himself helped build and shared with Shinnick the chore of maintaining. It was only about 4.5 feet tall, plenty enough to keep the livestock from making their great escape. But in his way of thinking, it might as well have been 100 feet tall. Not only did it keep those smelly beasts from their pursuit of curiosity of all the pleasures that awaited beyond the fence, but it kept his heart from the very same pursuit as well. If only. Just you wait. Maybe one day. I know there has to be more to life, but I can't. What about the ranch? What about my portion of chores? What about my father? The battle raged on in Basa's soul for what seemed an eternity, with the blazing hot sun provoking his body to retaliate in buckets of sweat. He'd already scooped what must have been a ton of oxen waste from the stall floor. Given the seemingly massive beastly appetite and the amount of feed that they consumed each and every day, there must have been a ton more to go before supper. This was a daily process, a daily battle. The time went on and more responsibility placed on Basa. And as he grew, so did the weight of responsibility, and so did the work. But that's not all that increased in weight for the vigorous young man. His carnal desires for whatever that was beyond that practical and dreadful fence, desires that he searched for, that he longed for, desires that he would in fact pursue, if only he could escape that measly 4.5-foot fence. It was too much to bear. And before long, Basa's eternal conflict had ceased as his mind made a treaty with his heart being the true victor. That is, if one could ever find a true winner in the battle of morality anyway. With his mind in alliance with his deceitful heart, there was a notable difference in his daily performance as his chores were falling behind. There was a notable difference in his attitude. He became short with the most ridiculous issues. First with the hired help, then with his brother Shinnick, and then with his father Jehohanan. What exactly is he searching for? Jehohanan thought to himself as he watched his son's wondering eye. What indeed was drawing his attention away from what was best for him in life? What was tempting him to sacrifice his safety, his stability, his substance that was all provided by his father Jehohanan? What was so appealing beyond the fence that he would be willing to trade the premium of his purity for the plenitive moment of pleasure? The type of pleasure that allows you to enjoy life for 1 minute, but then be enslaved with the consequences of that moment for the rest of your life. Jehohanan was still tormented by the plenitive moments of pleasure from his youth. He still bore the scars. He still relived the pain. And as much as he tried, he could not rid himself completely of the guilt. Now, Jehohanan was a man of faith, and he knew that Jehovah God was a God of his word. And when God promised Jehohanan, or anyone for that matter, that when one's personal faith was placed in God's means of salvation, which was given by grace through faith in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, then God would, in fact, and unequivocally remove one's transgressions from them. As far as the east is from the west, the innumerable sins, the grave mistakes, the foolish, hurtful, rash choices, the idle words spoken in anger, in foolish jesting, even in blasphemy, all would be forgiven and removed by Almighty God, and would be replaced with a peace that passeth all understanding, and would generate a joy that was truly unspeakable and full of glory. Jehohanan was truly thankful for so great a gift of salvation. But while salvation may redeem the sinner, it does not necessarily destroy the harvest. Jehohanan was too all familiar with the practical and physical principle of sowing and reaping. Having, by necessity, planted crops all his life, he understood that when he placed that one kernel of corn in the carefully prepared soil, Lord willing, and the creek didn't rise, or there was no drought that particular year, he knew that if all went according to plan, that one kernel would produce a corn stalk, and that stalk would, on average, yield 2 ears of corn, with each ear containing around 800 kernels. He knew that it could take as long as 3 months to see that corn ready for harvest. By the time that he had put that corn in the ground to the time that he could have it ground at the mill, or have it on the table, dripping with fresh cream butter and generously coated with a layer of salt. He knew that what you plant is what you get. Now, it may take some time to reap the harvest, but the harvest will always yield more than what was planted. And as much as this truth was beneficial in the physical world in order to sustain his life and the lives of his family, Jehohanan knew that the same truth is applied in the spiritual world and is devastating, as sin always has a price. And the price is far more than anyone can pay. His heart's desire and prayers to God was that Shinnach and Bassa would not have to experience the pain and lasting consequences of an injurious harvest sown with seeds of deceitful lust that he had tried so hard to protect them from, hoping that they would learn from his personal scars and not have to procure their own. But his fears for his son grew every day, as he would catch Bassa staring at the fence while he was supposed to be doing his chores. His encouragement was met with resistance. His advice and direction seemingly fell on deaf ears, and his wisdom was disregarded entirely by an ever-growing, resentful, and increasingly rebellious man-child. Then the day came. Physically, Bassa was now considered an adult, although the level of maturity was stunned by his discontentment and was lacking, to say the least. He had grown, but in a way that was unbecoming of a child of Jehohanan, and more importantly, a child of Jehovah. Bassa was now completely ruled by his deceitful heart, and his lust for what he had been searching for a good part of his life now. What exactly that was, he was not entirely sure. He just knew that he had been searching for something, anything, that was beyond that practical, but now in his tainted viewpoint, wretched fence. He had grown self-centered and now wallowed in his selfishness, which in turn created an internal environment where audacious considerations are not only created but also cultivated to the point of crass actions, which is a good description for the brazen demand for his inheritance. Jehohanan was taken aback for sure. Who was this youth that stood before him demanding an early release of what he had secured for his future? Who was that young man, and what did he do with his son? This was not the Bassa that used to be the apple of his father's eye, the little guy that at one time thrived to gain the attention and affection of his father, the strapping lad that loved the occasional piggyback ride on the way to market. No, this was a different boy that stood before him in a man's body, so bold faced, so foolish, so sad. Jehu was hurt by the demand, for he knew that this would lead, or he knew where this would lead his naive son, straight down a path that would lead out of the gate of that practical and protective fence. The fence that he had fond memories of constructing with his sons, teaching them the best methods of cutting and preparing the wood, with careful demonstration and instruction in the proper use of cherished tools that had been handed down for generations. In all his years of experience, there was no doubt in his mind this path would lead to a wasteful outcome. In spite of the empty assertion of his son's contrived plan, which sounded more like a get-rich-quick scheme or some harebrained pyramid or multi-level marketing pitch instead of a plan, nonetheless, it was the inheritance that he had laid aside for his sons. And whether it was divided later, which was Jehohanan's preference for the sake of practicality and the maximum amount of benefit to them and their prospective families, or if the inheritance was divided now, which was not advisable at all. Either way, it was theirs. And so he complied. A few days passed since the funds were withdrawn and distributed. Not much was said, but the tension between Besa and Jehohanan or Shunnik or his mother or any one of the hired servants became more intense as Basa's heart deceived him more and more until his intentions were exposed. As the day dawned that would replay over and over in his mind long after the sun would set, Jehohanan made his way to the kitchen to execute his daily routine of breakfast, a good cup of hot coffee, and his time of devotion before heading out for another day of intensive labor. This was the busy season, and everyone's help would not only be needed, but it would be necessary. It would be required in order to accomplish every task that the day held in store. But little did he realize that the day held something else in store as well. Some heartbreaking news. A discovery that would shake the entire ranch, not only on this day, but for many more days to come. He was amid his routine when he got that kind of sinking feeling that something just wasn't right. It was the kind of gut instinct, for example, that caused him on occasion to awake in the middle of the night with the urgency of thought, check on the sheep. His body would attempt to reject the notion and try to bring some reasoning to the situation for the purpose of acquiring the much-needed sleep as much as it could. There had been no sound of a cry, nor had there been a bone-chilling howl of the adversary making his move. Jehohanan had learned the hard way to trust the gut instincts, which had led him to the rescue of an unsuspecting sheep or ewe lamb on more than one occasion. But not this time. As he arose to follow the instinct and begin his investigation, Shinnick met him with a facial expression that exhibited a look of being surprised, but at the same time, not surprised in the least. Shinnick had begun his daily routine as well, which consisted of not only ensuring that he was prepared to start the day, but that his increasingly slacking brother had done the same. That is how he had made the discovery of Basa's true intentions, now on full display without question. He was gone. And he had left in the most cowardly way, in the middle of the night, without saying a word. Shinnick would be of the mind of wishing him good riddance, for he had grown weary of his having to pick up his baby brother's slack. And he would have, too, wished him good riddance, that is, had it not been for the quick realization that not only would he now be picking up the slack, he would be picking up the entire amount of Basa's responsibility, adding to his already insurmountable load. While Shinnick continued to fume at the unfairness of the situation, he failed to notice the tears formulating in his father's eyes that presently began to emanate down the worn but ever compassionate face of a man that felt in that moment that he had failed his son. Jehu Hanan's heart was broken, and his mind was consumed with his now wayward son's safety. He was concerned for his well-being. He was concerned for his soul. What could he have done differently? What could he have said to influence his son's hasty decisions? What words of persuasion might have been spoken that he would have produced a different outcome? Jehu Hanan could have spent the rest of the day pondering on the questions of what could have been or what should have been, but reality and the tug of responsibility insisted that he wipe away the tears from his eyes, which he could not seem to find a way to completely dry the moisture. But nonetheless, he rolled up his sleeves. It was going to be a long day. Shinnick dutifully reminded his father of his progressively cooling breakfast. But Jehu Hanan could not so much as swallow or talk due to the lump in his throat. He surely could not force something so intrusive as food down the obstructive tube. Besides any and all amount of appetite that had been snatched away with the recent revelation, along with the slightest amount of present joy. While the rest of the family weathered the disclosure of the morning's report, Bassa was well on his way in the start of his new life. He had covered some good ground and was making good time since the departure, and he really didn't even take consideration of what the others were thinking, feeling, or experiencing back home. No, he had made up his mind well before his bags were ever packed. So the choice was an easy one, and the transition from the bondage of responsibility to the freedom of finally living life, his own life and not that of his father's, was proving to be more uncomplicated than he had predicted. The hardest part, so far, was crossing the threshold of the gate to that practical and overpowering fence. Such an insignificant amount of effort, such a minimum stride it took to clear the gate's base. But it felt as if he were jumping a canyon spanning 60 cubits or more. But once he had surpassed the plain cedar wood posts and the cold steel fixtures that contentious gate was constructed of, he had never, in his life, felt more alive than he did in that moment, or at least at the present he could not remember. There was a thrill, a wonder of what the world would discover, of what he would experience, of what he would do, where he would go, what he would see, who he would meet. It was a bit overwhelming to think about, but at the same time, so exciting. Now, to be perfectly honest, there was an element of nervousness to his wonder, which only added to his excitement, enabling him to thrive off the thrill of it all and maintain a sharp focus of the mission, the goal to find whatever it was he'd been searching for all these years. In his limited knowledge or experience of the world, he had not the capacity to consider the many, many troubles that could potentially find him. The possibility of temptations that he didn't even know existed, completely eluded him. But then again, it didn't really matter, for his mind indeed was made up, and there was no turning back now. Happiness, true happiness, with unrestricted indulgence was just around the bend. And so, with his pockets full of his father's hard work, his mind completely consumed with the allure of useful lusts, and his feet as light as a sparrow's feather in the midst of a storm, he kept going until he reached the place of carnal fulfillment. And fulfilling it was to the point of Basa's almost conclusion that his search was over. Almost. For although there was pleasure in this current lifestyle of carnality, in the end, and to his bewilderment, The pleasure had proven to be just for a season. And one of the many beneficial installments of everyday practical experiences that he retained from his life on the ranch was that seasons may be long or they may be short. They may be mild or they may be severe. But they are all stitched together with one constant thread of truth, and that is the fact that all seasons always change. Time would fail to give all the details of Basa's downward spiral, but just know that it didn't take long, not long at all. He was perplexed as to just how soon removed his father's hard work was removed from his pockets, which, by the way, he discovered were not so deep as he thought them to be. He was confounded at the superficiousness of people that were so quick to be eager to become best of friends when the inheritance was prevalent and the carnality was in high gear, only to dissipate with the slightest hint of now low funds, forcing a downward shift to a much, much lower gear. He was mortified when he found himself in a state of destitution. He found himself in an unfamiliar state, one of, what would be the best word to describe? He found himself in a state of want. He wanted substance, but no man gave unto him. He wanted shelter, as he had none. He wanted security, which he was greatly lacking. He wanted affectionate support, but honestly, who cared? It took some time at the bottom of the barrel to even somewhat begin to see through the haze of what had been the most recent chapter of his life, if you could even call it that. It was more like an existence than a life. And on top of that, he was barely existing. With his background of working a ranch, he joined himself with one of the citizens of that country, who in turn rewarded Basa with the pleasure of harsh servitude. How could he have ever imagined that the bottom of the barrel would lead to one of the nastiest, smelliest, most disgusting places on the face of the earth? A place of muck and mire, a place of utter filthiness and waste. He heard some refer to this place as the hog pen. He referred to it as, well, it didn't really matter what he called it, because his life was basically over. He was so hungry that he would have settled for the maggot-infested slop that they fed the pigs with. He would have even settled for the scraps that the pig slop was made from. But due to the famine that had infested the land, even the husks that was left over from the slop was a commodity that carried a price that he was unable to pay. On the day that he assumed to be his last, and as he was exhorting the very last of his energy to feed the citizen swine, there was a thought, an insight, a revelation that hit him so hard that he likened it to a bolt of lightning that struck him out of nowhere, insomuch that his knees buckled and he fell in the mire, spilling the slop. What was he doing here? What had he done? How could he go on living this way? How could he have ever been so foolish? The revelation led to the formulation of a plan that, well, wouldn't work. It couldn't work. He had gone too far. He had surely burned the bridges that no doubt were beyond repair. Even if by chance he could go home, he was unworthy. He was unworthy of his father's love and acceptance. And he was so ashamed of his actions, his derelict of duty, his selfishness. But then he considered the slop that he had spilled. What if? What if I return not as my father's son, but rather as his servant, in which he would be beyond content to accept and to embrace as his new position in life? He remembered the compassion of his father, even to his hired servants, and he knew that he had to take the chance. The only alternative was to die in this place that some called a hog pen, but he called, well, no matter what he called it. His mind was made up, and he would need to conserve his strength to focus on the journey home instead of the particulars of his current state of extremely unpleasant abode. Time had passed as the sun continued to rise in the morning and set in the evening. The crops continued to be sown and harvested. The livestock continued to do all the things that livestock do to cause so much work, sweat, and constant supervision. Daily routines continued as well. Only now they commenced a little earlier for the added responsibilities that was distributed across the board in spite of Shinnick's initial fear of acquiring the entire load to himself. Most of the household had fallen back into their daily habits, most except Jehohanan, who had added a procedure to his normal routine of breakfast, in which he now found himself only able to get down enough to keep him sustained for the daily grind, his hot cup of coffee, which always seemed to be much better than it used to be, and his time of devotion, which was now consumed with more prayer than it had been before. But now included in his routine, he habitually walked down the road every single day, without fail, rain or shine, and spent some time just staring at the gate of that practical and imperious fence. What would he expect to find? Shinnick and the rest of the hired servants thought it to be a waste of time, useless, hopeless, but not Jehohanan. Although, to be honest, he was sometimes tempted to just let it go. Yet there remained a hope deep down inside that simply would not permit him to lose hope in his baby boy. No, sir. No matter the consensus of the rest, he would not cease to take that walk. He would not fail to stare at the gate of that practical and expectant fence. In his gaze, he would replay over and over again the monumental moments of Basa's childhood, the day that he was born, his first steps, Shinnick's pride of protection in his most imperative role as a big brother, as well as the times he had to step in and referee the two when outbursts of testosterone became too much to contain. He would also imagine the day that his wayward son would come walking down the road. He could imagine the joy, the excitement, the celebration that would be held if he would just come home. He did try to imagine what he might look like. However he would look made no difference. He just wanted to see his son once more. Still, he couldn't help but wonder, would he be in good health or would he be sickly? Would he be plump or bony? Would he have a full and well-groomed beard or would he be scruffy? As much as he tried, he struggled every day to imagine. Then one day, his imagination kicked into overdrive. As he was staring at the gate of that practical and heartwarming fence, he could finally imagine the physical appearance of his son. Although at a good distance away and very faint in general, he could make out just enough to see that it was not a very pleasant sight to imagine, to say the least. Jehohanan imagined Basa arrayed in dirty, worn, and tattered clothes that looked like they had once fit his body, but were now comparatively loose due to the apparent malnourishment of his son. His hair and his beard was overgrown, unkempt, and it gave the appearance of being matted due to what must have been a long season of absentee baths. That was the summation of his whole appearance. dirty, and no doubt just as fragrant as he looked. On top of that, his form was weak and his physique so skinny that he appeared to be on the brink of starvation. Jehu Hanan immediately felt ashamed of himself. After all this time of trying to imagine his lost son, when he finally has the ability, this is how he imagines him. He couldn't help it. He didn't wish to imagine Basa in this manner. It just happened. And even though his imagined vision of Basa further added to his broken heart, insomuch that he felt his tears break forth from the barrier of his eyes, he at the same time felt an overwhelming emotion of hope, one that he had not felt since the day before his son's unannounced parting. All the days that he had spent staring at the gate of that practical and splendid fence, trying to imagine a current interpretation of his son, was simply finding himself unable, or more realistically, deep down, not wishing to. Today was different. Today he was enabled. It seemed so real. Why? It is as if his imagination was getting the best of him, as the image of his son that started a way off in the distance gained ground slowly but surely, becoming more vivid. With each slightly staggered and labored step that his imaginary son took, it was so real that his emotions were raging. And what was that? That gut instinct that he had learned to trust, that feeling that he could never quite explain, that feeling that he had on many occasions when all odds were stacked against him, but just knew that everything was going to be all right. He remembered spending many a night in the stalls with a ewe that was in the process of giving birth to a lamb with complications, like dystocia, for example. It looked as if he would end up losing both before daybreak. But then that gut instinct would kick in and settle the nerves with the soothing calm that generated the unexplainable knowledge that somehow everything was going to be all right. His heart began to beat faster and faster as his imaginary son became more and more vivid, to the point of uncontrollable sobbing, and not so much with tears of sorrows as before, but tears of gratefulness that God would allow him to get a glimpse of his precious son, even if it was just an imaginary one. But then, it was as if he heard a voice of a faithful and familiar friend that simply said, "Run." And before he could even consider the ridiculous notion of running to an imaginary returning prodigal, he found himself in a full sprint. He had not been so light on his feet and felt as if he was just about to lift from the ground and take flight when he reached the gate of that practical and liberating fence. He didn't even stop. He just kept running through the gate, down the dusty road, until without full comprehension of his spontaneous actions, found himself in full embrace with his son. And if all of this was just a figment of his imagination, then reality could not be any more sweet. The reunion was made so much the more rewarding when the realization that, to the praise of Jehovah God in heaven, This was not the fantasy of imagination, but rather it was the manifestation of a lost son returning home. When the opportunity presented itself, meaning that at what time either of them could even formulate an utterance of sustainable words, Massa wasted no time. As he finished being wasteful in confessing his foolishness, he squandered not the chance to humbly request his father's forgiveness and make good on the intention of self abasement, and without hesitation requested a position of servitude, accepting his foregone prospect of sonship. But Jehoiada responded as if he had heard him not, as he called for his actual servants to bring garments and tokens of restoration. He called for preparations to commence, preparations for a celebration unlike previous or post in his son's return. They started toward the gate of that practical and beautiful pen, taking a few steps in between intervals of embrace and times of tears. The load of sorrow shedding by buckets full with each step they took, and at the same time being replaced with joy unspeakable and full of joy. For there was great occasion as the prodigal son of Jehoiada, who was dead and was alive again, was lost and is found. But that wasn't all that was found. As they crossed the gate of that practical, gracious, and ever merciful fence, Basically finally found what he had been searching. We've been considering the thought, what are you searching for? Luke 15, verse number 11. And he said, a certain man had two sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portions of good that falleth to me. And he divided to them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together. He took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. And he sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would have fain have filled his husks with the swine did eat, and no man gave unto him. And when he came to himself, he said, how many hired servants of my fathers have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and am no more worthy to be called thy son. Make me as one of thy hearts. And he arose and came to his. But while he was a great, his father saw it and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And his son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven, and in thy sight am no more worthy to be called thy son. But his father said to his servants, bring forth the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. and bring hither the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and be merry, for this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And he began to be merry. Sometimes we are so misguided by our heart and what we're searching for. But I hope you found it tonight. We celebrate the fact that he was laid in a manger over 2,000 years ago. The wise men came with the specific purpose of searching for that Christ child to worship. May God help us. What are you searching for tonight? What are you searching for? Tell you what, let's spend just a little bit of time in prayer. This altar's open. If you need to come, won't you come? Maybe you have gone astray. Or maybe you feel that heart beginning to tug, and you know it's not right. You know it's pulling you in a direction that is not going to benefit you or anybody else. Once you change your desire, once you search for that Christ child, as they did all those years ago, let's spend some time in prayer.